Hello, welcome to Cook Local, Eat Local, Chef Stephanie. Great to have you on the show.
It's great to be here. I'm so excited.
All right, well, this is great. I always like to get a little bit of our guest's backstory to start
Mhm.
with. So there are a few pieces of that, that we'll delve into in this conversation. But first, I always like to know, are you a lifelong cook or is it something, I came to it more as an adult. So where are
Mhm.
you in that journey? How did your interest in cooking come about?
Yeah, I grew up loving food in a lot of different ways. My mother's definitely sort of a big foodie. However, my father's definitely the type of person who he finds eating sort of an inconvenience to the other activities in his life. It's very bizarre as somebody who professionally
Yeah, I hear that.
but
I don't
I
get it.
understand that some people's lives out. My dad's, his background is in engineering, and he was a firefighter before he retired. So
Huh.
it's different lifestyle, different viewpoint. It probably also contributed to the fact that my grandmother, while she cooked a lot at home for her four children, well, not a great cook. Very post
Okay.
depression era, a lot of canned veggies,
Oh yeah.
steak until it's cooked and flip the other way, kind of like one of the pop
That sounds like some
classics.
cooking that was familiar in my household as a kid.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have probably grew up with that food in some
Mhm.
way or another. My grandmother and grandfather did grow a lot, so I do remember harvesting zucchini with them, and they had tons of raspberry bushes, so we would actually harvest those and sell them
Hmm.
on the side of the road. I remember
Nice.
they had a big walnut tree, and we used to collect the walnuts and then crack them and all that good stuff. So, we had fresh items that I was drawn to, but I also had those experiences where like, wow, this food is not satisfying. That being said, my mother's an amazing cook, and my parents are divorced. So I grew up in basically two very different households,
Yep.
and kind of fell in love with cooking with my mother. Yeah.
Oh, great.
So
Oh,
that's how I
nice.
started. Yeah, I think I dressed up as a cook for Halloween when I was like 8. And I remember as a kid having dreams about owning a restaurant, which I would never do as an adult. But
Right. That's a
um,
tough job for sure, even if
yeah,
you like to
yeah,
cook.
absolutely. So, it was kind of always an undertone for me that I was interested in food. My mother also loves medical anthropology. So I kind of fell
Hmm.
into food anthropology
Oh,
and
interesting.
understanding the cultural side of why we
Oh,
eat
okay.
what we eat.
Yeah.
Um, so as I became kind of more interested in my academic side, I really fell in love with food anthropology and sociology. But I started really honestly cooking professionally in high school.
Hmm.
I did a semester away. I grew up in Connecticut, East Coast,
Okay. Right. You
and
got the New England thing
yeah,
going.
yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in Connecticut, went to a boarding school there, and I took a semester up in Maine with a
Hmm.
program that's called Maine Coast Semester. It used to be called Chewonki.
Hmm.
Phenomenal program, focused
Hmm.
mostly on ecology, but they
Oh, hmm.
have an
Cool.
organic farm that's attached kind of to the school setup. So I used to do a lot of community kind of service and helping with harvesting and doing other farm chores. All of the cohort members had farm chores every morning too. And the beautiful
Hmm.
thing is we would use that produce in our community kitchen as well. So I volunteered a lot in that kitchen, got back to high school, realized that, boarding school lifestyle, while amazing and a lot of different positives that percolated from that point in my life. I felt like I was ready for college a year early. So I
Hmm.
left and then started working in kitchens while I was at my first college and kind of realized, oh, shoot, I should probably be going to culinary school. So that's how I transitioned professionally into the field. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Okay. Well, so you had early experience with farm to table
Yes.
there. Really. That's great.
Pre
Excellent.
farm to table being called farm to table, but
Yeah,
still.
right, right. And we're going to be talking specifically about, what you're teaching related to plant-based
Mhm.
cooking. And so where did that, when did, and I don't know, just because you're teaching,
Yeah.
I don't want to presume necessarily that you're only eating
No,
plant-based. It
I
sounds like you're
appreciate that.
okay, but you're teaching plant-based at the very least. So
Mhm.
when did that become a focus of yours? And maybe also, if you want to circle into how you landed doing
Yeah.
that at the Escoffier school would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So I, kind of fell in love with plant-based before it was called plant-based. So right around the time that I was up in Maine, um,
Yeah.
about 6 months to a year before that, I actually went vegan in high school, and the reason was actually it's quite comical now, but a friend of mine and I were training for Ultimate Frisbee in the spring season. We're like, oh, while
Hmm.
we're training, we should eat differently so we can feel better. So we turned it into a bet about becoming vegetarian and seeing how that would help us perform, and whoever could do it the longest basically won the bet. We never really culminated that bet, so I think I won at this point.
I was
But
gonna say, yeah, you probably won unless your friend
at this
is.
point, um, so, went vegetarian for a couple months and then swung into veganism pretty quickly just because of how I felt. But it was also, I was really getting into food policy at that point in my
Hmm.
life. I was very angry, as most teenagers are, about various things, but I was very politically motivated about our standard American diet and
Yeah.
kind of our growing practices in America as well. So for me as a teenager, not having too much control over my diet otherwise, or the ways that I can vote with my fork,
Hmm.
I thought the most logical thing for me to do was to do that by going vegan. So that's how
Right.
I started.
Yep.
And I, went through a classic culinary program as a vegan. So I worked off of
Mm.
sight, touch, and smell mostly,
Hmm.
particularly with animal products. So I still work with it because I knew I
Yep.
was going to cook for other people, not just
Right. Right.
myself. And there would have been no way to do the program that I did
Yeah.
without doing that. And so I worked for a lot of different businesses over my career, but really I had an undertone of loving teaching as well.
Hmm.
Growing up, I actually helped teach martial arts because I practiced Kenpo karate for many, many years. And I kind of fell in love with teaching there, and had the opportunity to help with a pilot study at my alma mater, or my undergraduate alma mater. We were looking at how health and wellness principles could potentially reverse prediabetes,
Oh, great.
using, cooking practices, but also
Hmm.
mindfulness techniques, all that. Um, so I really fell in love with seeing that teaching aspect as well. And then I stayed on for a year after my bachelor's program as a teaching assistant at my first college. So uh, that was really influential into why I got back into teaching.
Yep.
So I currently work for Escoffier as a lead chef instructor, and I oversee our plant-based programs as well as our holistic nutrition programs.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, we'll delve into some more of what you're teaching, some of the lessons for our listeners. But before we do that, I
Mhm.
want to pause and just get an example of something delicious you've eaten recently. Hopefully you have something delicious
Yeah.
you've eaten that you can share and tantalize us with. I'm already
Yeah.
getting hungry,
It's
thinking I'm going to hear some good.
yeah, it's interesting too because I'm so mood dependent, very very much because of seasonality
Hmm.
with my dining habits and when I tend to cook at home. Um, I have been loving just a good hearty veggie curry lately, particularly with
Hmm.
root vegetables since it's the
Yeah.
winter.
Right. Right.
I'm in northern Kentucky, so it's still got kind of these days at least, and it's still got the very kind of New England bite to it during the
Yep.
winter. So
Right.
still very much hunkering down with kind of the warming
Hmm.
spices and a
Yep.
little bit of that coconut milk, which brings in that fattiness too. I'm also a sucker for making arepas or like tamales
Oh,
and things like that, but
that
usually more
sounds
in the
good.
summer. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
That does sound good. And what protein do you use in that curry? Just to like
Yeah.
vary it? Yeah.
Yeah, so typically if I'm not doing any animal products, my husband is not vegan. So
Oh,
sometimes we'll do
gotcha.
kind of a pairing
Yeah.
like that. But typically I'll do, some beans, or I'll complement it with some quinoa as the base. Thinking about complementary
Yeah.
proteins and things like
Yeah.
that. Sometimes tofu or tempeh as
Hmm.
well.
Yep.
I do love a good tofu or tempeh, but I like to lean into beans and legumes more
Yeah.
frequently than soy products. Yeah.
Gotcha. Great. Well, that sounds tasty. One thing when we were emailing back and forth about setting this up that, caught my eye in terms of the intersection with our focus on this
Mhm.
Cook Local podcast is, you had that phrase eating local and seasonal ingredients. So
Mhm.
when you're teaching people about those concepts about how
Mhm.
to lean into seasonality, could you share us a couple of your best practices that you might convey to our listeners on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So some of my kind of go-to strategies for eating and purchasing locally and seasonally is getting to know your area more. A lot of folks don't kind of branch out beyond your local grocery store, that can be a great place to start. A lot of grocery stores, like a lot of the Whole Foods and smaller grocery stores, tend to acknowledge, these apples are from this orchard.
Right.
So you can get a little bit of that identification.
Yep.
But there's some amazing farms in most areas, and getting to know the growers and getting to know what's available in your area and when can make you feel more connected to the food that you're choosing to consume, and then also what you're cooking with it. So for me, that's kind of my big takeaway, is always go research, go find out.
Yeah.
There are, we think about different seasonal foods that we traditionally think about, but there are other, like I think about December, January in Northern Kentucky, and most people don't, think about shallots or sunchokes being in season, but they are. Or
Yeah.
thinking about indoor growing and how you can have microgreens that way, or different even
Right.
lettuces. So thinking beyond traditional farming practices can also help us broaden what does cooking seasonally and locally mean. So.
Yeah, that's great. I've really noticed that too, because I used to, one great way to cook seasonally, if you're doing like a CSA share, that's,
Absolutely.
mirroring what's local at the farms. But the one I typically had done historically ended, like mid-October, when they picked the last of the big squash and stuff like
Yeah.
that. But now, just like you say, it's really amazing what there's another thing called in this area called family dinner that does there. It's not one farm, but they sort of source from a bunch of local
Yeah.
farmers and bring it, to delivery service. And it's amazing what there's this time of year to the fresh, exactly like the microgreens. And I haven't seen the operation of how they actually do it. I guess it must be like greenhouse based that they're able to
Yeah,
do
there's
like them.
some greenhouse spaces, aquaponics as well. You can do indoors, aeroponics. So that, there's a lot of different practices that can allow you to do that. Or, thinking not just like microgreens, but mushroom production, super cool to be able to do
Yeah.
indoors, because you need that controlled environment anyway. So it's a really cool way to branch out beyond, thinking the winter and just root veg. Although I do love a good root veg.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course, there's been a long history of root cellars, of people
hmm
storing that for the winter time. Great.
Yeah.
Now, we were chatting. It sounds like you are not exclusively vegan in your house, and
hmm
we're similar here.
hmm
Well, we're all sort of mixed, trying to eat, in our house, to try to eat more plant-based foods,
Right.
but also eat meat. Try to eat mostly local when we can.
hmm
But tips for folks, I don't know, how your husband might be a good case in point, for somebody, whether it's a New Year's resolution or just
hmm
a goal to try to eat, whether it's, a certain number of times a week or just more proportionally plant-based foods in their diet, but
Right.
maybe are skeptical, how am I still going to get that satisfaction? Some tips on, carnivores that are trying to eat more plant-based, I guess maybe is what I'm trying to ask. Some of the
Yeah.
best tips on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I will say, depending on where you are in your journey, if you're, either planning on having a total overhaul or just trying to be more conscientious in particular meals, if you're still consuming animal products, try to get really good quality, ideally locally as
Yeah.
well. And thinking about, did they use regenerative farming practices?
hmm
Did that animal live a good life? Because the quality is going to be there, and you're going to be satisfied with less as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah, it's a good point.
So the quantity, thinking about just at how much you're consuming, and then,
hmm
you don't want to necessarily not add more to your plate at the same time if you're taking away. So,
Right.
because then maybe you're like, oh, well, I cut down on my meat, but now I'm still hungry. A lot of vegetables have a lot of really good fiber in it, which can help with satiation. So thinking
Right.
about just adjusting your portions in your dishes or on your plate, trying to, branch out and try different grains and legumes. If you're a household that just only consumes rice, there's some other really cool grains out there. Farro's
hmm
amazing, particularly
Yeah.
in
Oh, I
winter,
love farro. Yeah.
or wheat berries, which are
hmm
very similar, but super hearty. Quinoa's a one that's gotten really popular, but amaranth, millet, sorghum,
mm
you name it. There are a lot of different grains out there, and they provide such complexity to a dish
Right. Right.
that. So that's always my kind of recommendation is think about the quantities first, but then
hmm
also think about branching out. So if you're somebody who, really loves broccoli, but hasn't really ventured out on different vegetables beyond that,
hmm
finding vegetables that you're willing to try, because not everybody is, open, I'm going to eat anything and everything, which is
Right, right,
totally fine too. We all have our preferences, and we all have a history as to why we eat the way we eat.
right,
Um,
right,
and I also think it's not sustainable to completely overhaul your diet overnight
right.
on a
Good point.
whim, because
Yeah,
it's not sustainable. You're going to hit so many hurdles that it's not feasible for most people. If you're
yeah.
incredibly stubborn, you might be able to do it, but that's not the case for most
You would
people.
probably be in that, I forget, it's some abysmally low percentage of people, like 13% or something. Don't
Right.
quote me on the exact figure, but it's very low people that stick to New Year's resolutions. And I think it's
Absolutely.
because they're trying to do this 180-degree shift on something as opposed to gradually adding stuff that's more sustainable to their
Yeah.
habits, including eating.
Yeah, absolutely. So, just even trying one or two new veggies, or trying one new dish each week that,
Yep.
see if you like that dish. If you didn't like the dish, try something else. And if you like it, how can you, fold it into your repertoire while you're meal planning, if that's a thing that you do. Um, I think for me, that's always the smartest way, is thinking about what do you currently enjoy, and taking a moment to really identify why you enjoy it can help
Yeah.
you pinpoint, okay, well, I really like seared Brussels sprouts because they're awesome, and they got a little bit of char and they're hearty.
Hmm.
Well, think about Brussels sprouts. You could also sear cabbage that same way, and you can make
Oh,
different
yeah.
dishes with that.
Yeah.
Or you could think about, if I like seared Brussels sprouts, maybe I'll also like roasted cauliflower because it kind of has that browning too.
Right.
So thinking, I like this, so maybe I'll like this, and give it a try. I will also say, if you have food memories like overcooked Brussels sprouts, I think most of us
Yeah.
have had those at some point where they were
Right.
boiled and very
Yeah.
sulfurous. Um,
Right.
don't banish the veggie for the rest of your life. Just
That's
try
good.
it differently.
Yeah. That's a great policy. I hated beets growing up, and I
Mhm.
think the only way I had them was, I think they probably came from a can. They were just
Yeah,
boiled till they, oh, just the thought
right.
of it still makes me squeamish. But I love them, but I
It's a
almost
textural thing too.
almost
Yeah.
exclusively either roast or grill them.
Mhm.
And I think my whole family was influenced by that experience. We're not a beet loving family typically, or my
Mhm.
extended family, but I make this roasted beet dip that everybody loves,
Awesome.
including people that still say I hate beets. It's like, oh, this has beets. Wow, this is so good.
Right. And it's using that creativity to find ways that you'll enjoy it. So this must have been about a decade ago, but it was for Thanksgiving. I had gone home to Connecticut. I was living in New York at the time, and my sister is awesome and has gotten into food later in her life. But at the time, she was very against Brussels sprouts. I don't know why Brussels sprouts are on top of my mind today, but it's
Right.
the season, so why not? And I used to do this shaved Brussels sprout salad with an
Mm,
orange juice vinaigrette, some toasted almonds, some cranberries during the holiday season, and uh, it basically looks like a coleslaw, because
right.
I mean coleslaw is using cabbage too, just generally speaking, not green cabbage instead of Brussels sprouts. So
Yeah.
she's eating this and she's like, "Oh, this is really good. What is it?" Brussels sprouts. I got you. So, ah,
Nice.
um, so it's one of those things that thinking through, okay, what do I not like about something? Maybe I'll try it this way. Can be a
Yeah.
great way to try it differently, and also thinking, locally and seasonally, thinking about beets, different types of beets too, because golden beets versus red beets versus candy stripe all are a little bit different. And
Hmm.
some folks love golden beets because they don't have as much of that. I actually really like that kind of dirt quality that red
Yeah.
beets can
Yeah.
have, but for some folks that's just like heck no, like
Right.
absolutely not.
Right.
So, which we all have different palates as well, and
Right.
there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
So trying different varietals can be really
Hmm.
helpful too.
Yeah. That's a great tip. When you were talking earlier, I was almost going to ask that, but I think it's a good concept now. When
Mhm.
you're clearly trained, as you said, with traditional, I'm guessing that's sort of French type
Mhm.
preparations and stuff. Can you give an example of any example of how you would do any kind of the classic sauces or other preparations that in a vegan manner? Kind of curious about
Yeah,
how you
absolutely.
adapt something.
Yeah, so it really depends on the classic. So we're talking classic French sauces predominantly,
Yeah.
because when we think about other classic sauces like chimichurri, something like that, typically those herb sauces are already
Right.
predominantly um, vegan or vegetarian. Like
Yeah.
pesto, you can make vegan. Typically, there's Parmesan in it.
Right. Right.
But you can, what I like to do actually is use, instead of pine nuts, because typically pine nuts are quite not economically friendly as well.
Right.
So
Right.
I'll toast pumpkin seeds, and they actually
Oh,
end up
yep.
having sort of a cheesy quality to
Mhm.
them.
Hmm.
So I'll use that as a base. And
Yeah.
then some folks do also like to put in some nutritional yeast to add a
Yeah.
little bit of that cheesy note as well, but not as much as the Parmesan. So
Right.
you know, there's some quick substitutions like that.
Yeah.
Thinking about like the mother sauces, sauce tomate, sometimes does, from a classical standpoint, have pork fat in it. That's
Yeah.
as simple as subbing out some olive oil, which
Yeah.
most people do not make tomato sauce with pork fat anymore.
Right. Right.
You know, so
Maybe in
that's an
little
easy
towns in
switch.
Italy, maybe, but
Yeah, exactly. But when we're talking about things like velouté or bechamel, so let's take bechamel.
Mhm.
The classic base is made from a roux. So
Yeah.
roux is typically a 1-to-1 ratio of fat to flour. A lot of
Mhm.
times you'll see it with butter, but you
Yep.
can use you can use oils or even plant-based butters.
Mhm.
So typically, I actually do canola oil. When we think about commercial cooking, you know,
Mhm.
if we're making roux, we're making a lot of roux,
Right. Right.
which means, you know, food cost is even more paramount. So
Right.
typically, a lot of commercial roux are made with oil anyway.
Yep.
But we start with that, you know, cook it a little bit to kind of coax out some of that raw flour flavor and also develop a few more flavors. And then from there, for bechamel, we're adding in dairy.
Yep. Right.
So luckily, there are a lot of different plant-based dairy products out there on the market these days.
Mhm.
If you were really, you know, cutting your price point back, you could also use water, but it's not going to have tons of flavor. So
Right. Right.
I would highly recommend not doing that. But
Yeah.
you know, these days we have some traditional non-dairy milks like soy milk and even
Yep.
almond milk and cashew milk, but oat milks are great too.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
you know,
I
there's
haven't
a
tried
lot of
those.
oat milk is really good. It's got a kind of a round mouth feel or palate
Mhm.
to it. It's really lovely. I will say most commercial oat milks tend to separate pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Give it a good shake before you use it. But
Okay. Yeah.
it's as simple as soaking some oats and blending it in a food processor too. So honestly,
Hmm.
it's a very simple thing that you can make at home, especially if you're trying to. There's a lot of non-dairy milks that have a lot of additives to help bind it or sweeteners. So at the same time, you know, making a non-dairy milk at home is feasible for a lot of people. Just
Cool.
soaking.
Yeah.
So typically, you know, you could pour in oat milk and you're going to stir that so that the roux comes together with the oat milk. And
Mhm.
classically for bechamel, usually we add in a little bit of nutmeg, like a bay leaf. Sometimes we'll
Mhm.
add in a sachet, which is a combination of parsley stems and
Oh,
a
yeah.
few other aromatics, maybe you know, garlic clove. So all of that is still fine. It's basically just predominantly pulling out the animal products and
Yeah.
finding appropriate substitutions. We'll say hollandaise is the trickiest one
Yeah.
because of egg yolks.
Right.
And
Right.
yeah, I mean, you can get into molecular gastronomy and do some really funky,
Mm.
cool
Mhm.
alternatives. But generally speaking, if you're trying to mimic the technique, that one is really difficult too.
Yeah.
But you
Yeah.
can make a hollandaise, you know, using silken tofu to get a very similar mouthfeel.
Yeah.
The difference is you're blending it and emulsifying it that way rather than
Mhm.
creating, you know, cooking your egg yolks first and
Yeah.
tempering it that way.
That makes sense. Great. That's interesting. Yeah, you've clearly had a lot of experience adapting. Great. Well, let's talk, you know, I want to be sure we give you a chance to, you know, explain a little bit more about the, you know, the program you're managing there, the Escoffier plant-based program, and, you know, who's it designed for? What kind of folks are signing up? You know, is it, you know, a kind of thing, if I want to take one class, or people working toward a degree, all that kind of 411 about the program.
Yeah, absolutely. So for the plant-based programs, we actually have a diploma program, which is quintessentially a cooking certificate, and then we have an associate level. So you
Yeah.
kind of can choose your path as far
Hmm.
as that goes. And there's basically a time difference in general education courses that correspond with the associate's level, as
Yeah.
well as a second externship. And what externship is essentially an external internship
Yeah.
So you have to get industry experience to complete your degree,
Right.
which is great because you also, build a network so that when
Yeah.
you graduate, you potentially have job opportunities. So with the diploma program, we start with foundations. We move into kind of more advanced foundations, go into some baking and pastry techniques geared towards plant-based, which uses similar techniques but using plant-based products. Which
Yeah.
not all same thing with mother sauces.
Yeah.
Classic French baking also a little tricky. So we
Sure.
go
Sure.
we go through a lot of substitutions there.
Yeah.
And then we migrate into some more advanced topics. So seasonality in plant-based cuisine, plant-based approaches to wellness, thinking about different traditional diets as well as new diets or more not necessarily trends, but more modern diets that correspond around health and wellness.
Yep.
And then they move into cuisine classes. So
Mhm.
kind of giving a world tour between 2 6-week classes around the globe of plant-based dishes that are either inspired by that cuisine or are traditionally from that cuisine, depending on what the dish is. So
Yeah.
it's a very great broad overview of a lot of different techniques as well as different applications for plant-based cooking. Within both the diploma and the associate's program as well, we have a few business courses. So menu design, food service management, and entrepreneurship. So the whole point is that, this program, both the diploma and the associate's program, it's great for someone who maybe is living a plant-based lifestyle and wants to be in the food service industry. Maybe they have dreams of opening their own restaurant one day, or maybe a food truck, or maybe private catering services as well. Maybe they want to manage somewhere. They don't want to own something. That's perfectly fine. And goals can change throughout your life as well.
Sure.
So typically we see a lot of folks who, are plant-based, wanted to go to culinary school, but did not want to work with animal products.
Right. Right.
So this is the perfect opportunity. If I was in culinary school now, it would have been a great opportunity as well. So I'm just very delighted that we have that option for a lot of folks that otherwise may feel ostracized in the culinary education sector.
Yeah.
But we also have a lot of students who are interested in the program because they may have clients that are plant-based, or they plan on having part of their food truck or their catering that caters to plant-based individuals. So we have a lot of graduates from our other programs that may then explore the plant-based track so that they can develop out their repertoire. So we kind of see a little bit of both.
Yeah. Yeah. It sounds great. Like, yeah, I could see a lot of different angles where it would make sense for people. And timing wise, is it like a traditional academic calendar, or is it, enrolling? If somebody heard this and said, boy, I'd love to sign up, but when could they get going and that sort of thing?
No, that's a great question. So we actually are basically running year round, and we start new programs every 6 weeks.
Oh,
So
great.
it's great. If you're like, I've been waiting all my life and this is, I'm ready to make the jump, you pretty much can make the jump. So we just started a cohort 2 days ago. It just, it's the beginning of our January term, but in February we'll have a next start. So it continues and evolves, and courses are 6 weeks long. So you're really diving into a topic very in depth for that 6-week period, and then you move on to the next.
Oh, great. Yeah, that's good. Good way to do it. Gives a lot of windows of opportunity for people to get involved. Great.
Yeah.
And so how would people find out more?
So if you'd like to find out more about either a plant-based program or one of our many other programs, it's escoffier.edu. So it's ESCOFFIER.edu. Great.
And we'll include, if you're driving, and I hope you didn't try to write that down, and we'll include a link in our show notes. So, well, great, Chef Stephanie. It's been great to have you on the show. Very informative, and some good tips for our audience.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Definitely. Cool. All right. Excellent. We got it. Good. Yeah, I think we